One, take one.
What is at stake in the negotiations about participation between the oil companies and the producing countries?
What is essentially at stake as far as the companies are concerned is this. The companies have already conceded the principle of participation, but have conceded it on the understanding that satisfactory arrangements will be made on the question of compensation for the interests that are being transferred and on the disposition of government oil. In essence, the company's interests in reaching a satisfactory agreement on these two heads in fact produce company interests in the matter which correspond very closely to those of the consuming countries themselves. If the compensation terms are inadequate, this will certainly seriously affect the ability of the industry in the future to maintain oil supplies at reasonable costs, because their cash flow will be adversely affected. And secondly, if satisfactory arrangements are not made regarding the disposition of government oil, then the continuity of supplies to consuming countries could be adversely affected.
But what do I mean by adequate terms for the companies?
On compensation, the OPEC negotiators have fixed quite firmly to the view that compensation should be on the basis of the net book value of the assets that are being, physical assets that are being transferred. The companies, on the other hand, have taken the view that what is being transferred is a 20% interest in the rights that the companies were conceded under the original concession agreements. And that interest includes, very importantly, the right to produce crude oil either over the period of the concession in the future or over the period that the reserves that have been discovered last. Therefore, adequate compensation must necessarily include a recognition that it is more than the value of the physical assets that are being transferred.
But you say recognition of the principle here. That means there are space for a compromise on that.
There is certainly space for a compromise. In the negotiations that have been underway now since early March, the company side has from time to time departed from the strict definition of full commercial value for these interests. But so far, without any response by way of reaching compromise from the other side. I personally take a fairly optimistic view of the likely outcome of these negotiations. I believe, in the end, a satisfactory agreement will be reached, under which the producing countries concerned will be able to achieve 20% participation in the concession.
In terms of money, what is the value of what is being negotiated? Present stage in the dispute between the companies and the producing countries. You said you were fairly optimistic, but on the other hand, what is those rumors coming from circles around OPEC, they're not, as far as I can see, optimistic.
Rumors that circulate publicly are very different from the indications that company negotiators may receive from the OPEC negotiators privately. I take an optimistic view because the last round of talks ended on a fairly cordial note. It is true that since then there has been an OPEC conference where certain noises were made, and it is possible to interpret these noises in a number of different ways. But I think the significant thing is that there was nothing in the OPEC conference that suggested any sort of ultimatum, or that there was no intention not to resume negotiations. And I feel fairly confident that these negotiations will in fact restart and will ultimately reach a successful conclusion.
That means you don't believe in... But you have all the time been speaking about 20%, but it's also well known that some of the OPEC countries and some of the countries which are participating in the talks are after more. Some of them has as their ultimate aim 51%, which means in fact a nationalization.
This is true. This is quite clearly stated as being the ultimate objective. My comment on that would be, however, that I believe the concept of an ultimate 51% participation in the producing companies, from the producing country's point of view, is regarded as being a better alternative to complete nationalization of these companies. It is true that the OPEC countries collectively have a very major proportion of the world's oil reserves within their territories. It is equally true that the large established companies provide for these countries the continuing opportunity to ensure that that crude oil is turned into its full value in terms of return.
But do you think the companies are willing to accept, maybe not now, but maybe later, a 51% solution?
I believe the attitude to a 51% solution may well differ as between one company and another. But of one thing I am certain, it is, I believe, quite possible that there will be unanimity of opinion on this, given that the arrangements under which the 51% share by the governments are concluded include the very necessary protection from minority rights in the company, which is a well-known procedure in a number of companies.
What significance has the step that the Shah of Iran has taken recently? He is not longer for participation. Which significance has this in the present negotiations?
The Shah has certainly stated quite firmly that participation is not for Iran. And my only comment on that would be that I believe that this is a demonstration which no doubt will be noted by the other members of OPEC, that participation may not be the only possible solution to the problem. There are other routes, and the Shah has taken one other route.
But it also, in a way to an outsider, look as if the unity of OPEC has now been split. And I would like to ask you, as a representative of one of the big oil companies, what you feel today, only 1.5 years after.
I would prefer...
Sorry. But it also looks as if the Shah, by his move, has split the former unity of OPEC, and I'd like to ask you, as representative of one of the big oil companies, about your feelings today, 1.5 years after OPEC, through unity, nearly dictated the oil companies' higher prices.
I'd prefer not to express a view on whether OPEC dictated higher prices to the oil companies in the early part of 1971. But as far as the unity of OPEC is concerned, on the participation issue, the record shows that some of the OPEC members take different views of how participation should be achieved, although there is a considerable similarity between these views. It would appear that both in Nigeria and in Libya there is very likely to be a rather different approach to the problem, somewhat different from the approach that Sheikh Yamani is taking. I think there is a widespread feeling among the OPEC members that the time has come for the producing governments to have some share in the operations of the producing countries. And in that sense, with the exception of Iran, there is a fair measure of unanimity.
But on the other hand, there's also, I would say, as far as it can be seen from outside, there is a division of opinions on the participation issue inside OPEC, and this is not exactly the best background for an action or the threat of an action in order to underline OPEC's stand through the negotiations. In other words, the move or the steps the Shah took is a strengthening of the position of the oil companies.